So good evening, guys, once again, and we are back with day five of this initiative of Civils Daily, called Daily Answer Wars and Daily Answer Wars Prime. So give me a thumbs up if I'm visible and audible, and we will start the session right now. I think it's fine. So good evening, Varsha, and let us start the session today. Again, the format of the session will be similar. We will first discuss the question that was given to you in the morning, and then we will go on for evaluation and feedback of some of the copies that you have submitted in the Telegram group before 2 p.m. Uh, because GS3 paper has that topic of environment, but this was related to a bit related to geopolitics and clean energy, so it became a part of international relations in GS2. Now, clean energy has been the order of the day, is the order of the day. Describe briefly India's changing policy towards climate change in various international fora in the context of geopolitics. So this was the question. Basically, we there was a statement given that clean energy is the order of the day, and after that, it was basically asking India about India's policies of climate change, and you had to relate it a bit towards geopolitics, that is international relations, international politics, like how India has evolved its policy or what all changes India has done to its thinking over climate change. So basically, we had to talk about that in the body of the answer. So again, we will go in that similar manner. Like first, we will start with the introduction and then see what all we could have written in the body, and then we will go for the conclusion. So let us start with the introduction. If we see, so we can talk about this Panchamrit strategy in the introduction. For example, it had basically five components. So it is not necessary to write it in the intro itself because we will be talking about India's policies and politics in the next part of the answer. But here you could have just introduced the strategy. For example, I have written that India recently announced new climate targets at COP26 under its Panchamrit strategy, and one or two most important targets related to clean energy could have been mentioned. So it has taken a bold leap towards cementing its commitment to clean energy and letting the world know its future approach towards fighting climate change. So basically, the question is asking about India's approach to climate change, like how it has evolved. So this can be a good linking statement also to the next part of my question. So India has basically accepted the net zero commitments by 2070. So you could have mentioned that, and it has reiterated its stance that its policy on climate change is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So I have touched upon two or three important things or keywords you can say. For example, this common but different responsibilities, Panchamrit strategy, net zero commitments. All of these are some of the important keywords regarding to India's policy of climate change or uh, India's approach towards climate change. So I've tried to use it in the intro and then mentioned a linking statement basically. Which completed my introduction, and then we move on to talking about uh, the body of the answer, like what all we could have written in the body. So first part of the question is says that clean energy is the order of the day. So some amount of explanation was expected over this statement. Like you can just this statement basically means like clean energy is getting prominence or becoming prominent all over the world. Everyone is talking about clean energy. So you had just to show that how clean energy is becoming the order of the day. So if you can just mention three or four good examples about the importance of clean energy or the prominence of clean energy in the global discussions, I think that would have been sufficient to explain this statement or substantiate this statement. So in the first part of the body, I have just substantiated this statement itself. So talking about clean energy being the order of the day, I have talked about the commitments of three, four important countries. You could have taken any three, four. That was not an issue, but one of them should have been India. And next, you could mention about EU, United States, China. So these are some of the important players in current day's world, and hence I have tried to talk about their targets and uh, how that their targets had made clean energy the talk of the town. Like if the most powerful or the most uh, accepted powers of the world keep on talking about clean energy or take clean energy seriously, of course it will become the order of the day. So that is basically my thinking behind explaining these points or talking about the targets of the some of the countries. Here you could have just mentioned those targets which you remembered, especially EU and United States are a bit easy to remember, so you can note it down and keep it in memory for your further reference in future. Basically, India was also easy because India you had to talk in detail anyway in the next part of this answer. So India has committed to achieving 500 gigawatt of installed electricity capacity from non-fossil fuel sources by the year 2030. So this was one of the targets under the Panchamrit strategy, and this was one of next target was 50% of its energy requirements from renewable energy by 2030. So such stiff targets mean that the clean energy is pretty important in today's day and time. Next, I have talked about United States. So United States has decided to achieve a 52% reduction from 2005 levels in economy-wide net greenhouse gas pollution in 2030. So 50, this actually after Trump, when Joe Biden has become the president, he has uh, decided to achieve this target, and this was announced in, I guess, April 2021. So you can talk about this. Next, China also targets for renewables to supply 33% to national power consumption by 2025. So China has set a target for very near future, that is 2025, and that is 33% to national power consumption. So any two or three of these targets, I think, would have been sufficient to show the importance of clean energy, or so that the most of the countries all over the world are taking clean energy quite seriously. So that was the first part of the answer. Next, we move on to talking about India's changing policy towards climate change. So in this, we will first mention some of the factual points and then go on to analyze like how India's policy has changed, or like what are the major components of India's policy towards climate change. So if you could have mentioned that, uh, that would have been sufficient. There are some very important principles that India follows. It was compulsory to mention that. I will discuss that in the answer itself, and you could have just backed it up with some examples, which India has been taking in very near past or recent past. So first and foremost is India has committed to climate. So here you could have also talked about Paris deal and India's nationally determined contributions like INDC. So that would have also sufficed. But because this is the recent one, I have decided to talk about COP26 and the Glasgow targets that India has set for itself. So here in details, I have talked about all the five targets: 500 gigawatt non-fossil energy capacity by 2030, 50% of energy by renewables by 2030, reduction of total projected carbon by 1 billion tons, reduction of the carbon intensity of the economy by 45% over 2005 levels, and achieving the target of net zero by 2070. I hope that all of you know about net zero. This is basically the uh, sum of carbon emitted and the carbon absorbed. If you emit some carbon, you are expected to do some take some measures that absorb carbon, or create a carbon sink. So total emissions versus absorption should come to zero. So that is basically the idea of net zero. That target has also been fixed by India till 2070. So these were basically the climate commitments, and this is basically the factual part that you needed to mention to give some context to your answer. If you just talk about India's policy, or more about what India thinks or how India thinks without giving some concrete examples, I think that will be a bit mm, not impress the examiner a lot, because you need to back your arguments by some facts. So I have first in the first point itself just made it clear that these are some of India's very important climate commitments, and that is very decent ones also. So after that, I go on to talk about India's thinking behind its climate policies, like how it has evolved. So first and foremost, India sticks to like no legally binding targets. Now, as all of us know, India is a developing country, and we mostly are the voice of the global south, which consists of mostly the uh, least developing or the developing countries. So we are expected to also pay attention to our developmental goals rather than just talking about climate change, because uh, the amount of poverty or the amount of poor people or everything related to development is pretty low in these countries. So you cannot just expect these countries to pay full attention to climate change or go renewable and stop giving power to its domestic sector. So India has decided to. So we move on to talking about common but differentiated responsibilities. So here, India has emphasized upon the foundational principles of equity and CBDR, and called on the developed countries for climate justice and for undertaking rapid reductions in emissions, as they have used more than their fair share of depleting global carbon budget. So now these developed countries are releasing carbon in the atmosphere or greenhouse gases since the times of industrial revolution, and most of the developed or developing or the least developed countries have lagged behind. They have been the uh, colony bearers of colonialism. Like they have already remained poor since lot of years. So the most of the emphasis should be on these developed countries. So India has basically emphasized upon this principle only in most of the forums, that there should be a common but differentiated responsibility. Common means that common target should be common. Like we need to fix upon some common targets as we have fixed in Paris. But we need to responsibility for meeting that target should be differentiated according to the amount of harm each country has done to the climate. For example, most of the developed countries, including countries in EU and the US, are far ahead in using their share of global carbon budget. So they should take on more responsibility. So this has been India's argument in most of the like uh, conferences that India attends, or geopolitical events that India attends. So you can talk about this. Next, in recent times, we also see there is a change. India has took on the leading role in many initiatives for climate change. So this was not seen in earlier times. For example, this International Solar Alliance, One Sun, One World, and One Grid program, and very recently launched this Lifestyle for Environment movement. All of this has been launched with the initiative of India. So India has taken a leading role along with other major global players in several international initiatives such as the ISA, OSOWOG, and the Life movement. So you can just talk about that. So this basically shows India's approach being changed from reactionary to participatory. So you can talk about that. For example, in earlier times, India just reacted to what the uh, major powers or the global superpowers talked about. Like India just said that we can do this or we can't do this, or just reacted on it without participating in it wholeheartedly. But in recent times, we can see that India has come forward and started participating in alliances, or even one step ahead, just started to form alliances or take the leading initiative. So that has become the core of India's climate commitments in recent times. So you can talk about that change of approach from being reactionary to participatory. Next, you can talk about technology transfer and climate finance. In this also, like India is on the side of the global south, or you can say the developing countries. So there is a lot of bickering over climate finance. If you are aware with the environmental initiatives in recent times, you will understand that most of the developed countries do not want to commit to climate finance. Like they don't want a pre established rules that they have to supply this and this amount of money to the developing and underdeveloped nations. But these nations in on their turn ask for that funds and technology transfer. So that has been a very contentious issue. There has been arguments and disagreements over that. But we see in the very recent summit COP27, we saw some progress over that. So India raised its concerns regarding reluctance of developed nations in sharing funds and necessary technology with the developing nations to enable them to effectively deal with climate change. So here also India has been playing a leading role and asking for some type of mechanism for climate finance and technology transfer to be established. Next, we can talk about, if you see the question is also asking about linking it with geopolitics. So if you think about geopolitics, you will just think about regional leadership or relationship between different countries or bilateral cooperation. So if you think on those lines, again you can come up with one or two points. For example, when we talk about regional leadership, especially in groupings like BIMSTEC and SARC, India is the leading player. We are the most important or the major country in these groupings, and all of these groupings have a component regarding to environment and clean energy. So you can just link it here that various regional organizations like BIMSTEC and SARC, where India is a major player, are actively pursuing clean environmental goals for shared prosperity. And next, we can also talk about bilateral cooperation. For example, very recently, India and Denmark have launched the Green Strategic Partnership. And not only India and Denmark, if you look at the uh, treaty agreements or the press conference after agreements between different bilateral talks between two countries, you will always see that there is an environment component or talks over clean energy, like what all initiatives both the countries are taking. So you can just mention any two or three countries that about that partnership. This was a recent one, so I have talked about India and Denmark here. So India has also been getting into agreements with various countries in order to work towards climate change. So as example, I mentioned about India and Denmark and its green strategic partnership. So these were the major points that you could have written in the body of this answer. Uh, some basic points that you could not have missed are like this emphasis on CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, and India again uh, adhering to no legally binding targets, some of India's climate commitments. So these were some of the major points that should have found a place, because these are India's philosophies regarding to climate change. Like India has always thought along these lines and keeps these arguments in the conferences that India participates, or in the diplomatic uh, meetings that India takes part in. So these are important points that you could not have missed. And next, if you could be a bit innovative, you could have talked about these regional leadership and bilateral cooperation or multilateral cooperation also in various groupings that India is a part of. So I think that was sufficient for this answer. Like two parts were pretty important in this answer. The first part was talking about why clean energy is the order of the day, or just substantiating or agreeing with the question that clean energy is indeed the order of the day. You could have just mentioned three four examples or three four points which prove this statement, because there was no scope of like disagreeing with it. Clean energy is indeed the order of the day. Most of the countries are participating in discussions. Many agreements continuously keep on happening over it. We see reports in the media from various organizations, right from IPCC to multiple organizations. So you could have just mentioned those things also. If you did not remember like exactly about the targets of the countries, you could have talked about some report, like some fact from IPCC, or you could have talked about uh, United Nations Environment Program rankings. So those things can also substantiate that clean energy is essentially very prominent nowadays. And after that, you just needed to talk about what are India's major points when it goes for discussions on climate change, or what India is doing from the perspective of climate change. So if you could have explained 5 6 points there, I think that was sufficient. After that, you could have done extra is just mention two or three challenges that India faces. For example, you can mention about development issues. For example, although India seems very keen on climate goals and like talks a lot about climate, but still we have like developmental challenges. More than 25 26% of India's population is very poor. So we just cannot overnight shift from electricity through coal or fossil fuels to renewable energy. So you can talk about those things like domestic commitments or developmental goals. There are many parts of the country where electricity is still reaching or has just reached. So expecting like renewable energy to replace it so fast is a bit like a stiff target. So you can mention those things if you wanted to. Some of the challenges that India will face. There are also challenges by climate deniers. You can say, for example, US withdraw from the Paris deal when Donald Trump was the president. So there are many countries which do not agree with all these things, and reaching a consensus has been pretty hard, as we have seen in multiple agreements. So you could have just talked about those things also in the challenges part if you had the scope to write. Basically, if you had the space and had the word limit, you could have mentioned that part also. You could have just used a flowchart, a hub spoke diagram, and mentioned two or three points. After that, we come to the conclusion of this answer. So in conclusion, we can just summarize this whole argument. So, as I have talked about, that India's approach is recently been changing from reactionary to participatory. So, keeping that in mind, I have just given a context. Like India has always championed harmony with nature since ancient to modern times. Like India has always argued for being friends with nature. Even if you see in our ancient texts, there are many medicines or use of nature in the human life. So, doctrine of harmony has always been practiced. So, you can talk about that. And next, give some example to just reinforce it, because just explaining the statement does not make sense. So, I have talked about Paris Accord net zero targets again to say that the that India has indeed championed harmony. So, of late, what India has done, like India has the ambition of becoming a major power, and in that regard, India has shifted its approach a bit from reactionary to participatory, which I just discussed in this answer. So, summarizing it, as said that India has moved away from a reactionary to a participatory approach, as seen in its diplomacy at the UNFCC. So you can just mention this conclusion and end this answer. I think this was a sufficient enough answer to get some decent marks in this question. Next, we'll move on to checking some of the copies, like what all you have written in the answer and what more you could have done. Varsha, I'm not at all confident. No problems, Varsha. We will see what you have written. So let us check your copy. Currently, India is the world's third largest producer of renewable energy with 40% of its installed electricity capacity coming from non-fossil fuels. The Indian government announced Panchamrit at COP26, mainly achieve net zero emission by 2070. So it is fine. You have just talked about some of the current news, and I think that is okay in the introduction. No need to worry about the introduction part here. Clean energy is the order of the day. Let us see next. India's changing policy towards climate change. Okay, so you have just missed this part. Whenever there is a statement given in such questions, it is wiser to like just to describe or substantiate that statement. Even if you are substantiating it in short, like 2 or 3 points, it is good enough. That just shows the examiner that you're aware of everything around what has been asked, and you are just trying to explain to him that uh, to agree or disagree with the statement that has been given. Sometimes what happens, there is a very blunt statement given in this statement. So it is not necessary that you agree with it. You sometimes can disagree or just give a context that my next part of my answer will be an analysis or a critical analysis of what is given in this statement. But here the statement was pretty uh, generic, so you just needed to agree and just say that clean energy is indeed the order of the day. 1 or 2 points substantiating it would have been pretty good. So I think you have missed that part. Next, let us see what you have talked about, India's changing policy. Focus on building a southern coalition. India, in the initial years of building a framework convention after the Unga resolution, garnered the support of developing nations by emphasizing that the prime responsibility of reducing greenhouse gases started. Okay, concept of CBDR. So this is good. Again, India is also here. You can say leader of the global south. So this is good. I think India is indeed a leader of the global south. What you can do here is just break it into 2 3 parts. That is what I have done in my answer. For example, there are 2 3 issues about global south. For example, you can say that climate finance and technology transfer, that is related to global south itself, because most of the countries in south are poor, so they want funding and technology transfer from developed countries. So I have broke that point and argued that India has also talked about this thing. Next, no commitment to a legally binding target. That is also one of the arguments of the countries of global south, because again, most of the countries have stiff developmental challenges, so they don't want to just posed or fixed target for climate change, because that will again affect their developmental patterns. So that is also, those 2 points are like basically breaking up upon this point itself. But still, let us see what you have talked about in the next part. Concept of CBDR is good. This was an important point which needed to be mentioned. Equity and per capita convergence, where the uh, central plank of India is negotiating initially, and India was successful in UNFCCC, coming to the conclusion that the largest share of historical and global emission. Okay, so I think this is not a new point. This is basically CBDR only explained in this, because you are talking at the end of the same thing. Like most of the responsibility should be for developed countries. So I think you can just integrate it and use these keywords. For example, equity and per capita management in this point itself, in concept of CBDR. Specific legally binding mitigation targets, and I think this is not clear what you have written. Though India's coalition building skills in COP with you and alliance of small talents. Uh, so this is a bit off target, I think. Specifically, legal binding mitigation. Of late, India has, as I said, has started to pick, stick to some targets, or limit itself to targets. For example, this net zero target was also a very big topic of discussion before Modi ji announced it in COP26. Like, if you were reading the newspapers, you must have seen that many foreign dignitaries were also writing and urging India to take up some target, or target about net zero. But India was a late comer to this club, and finally, after much deliberation and all, India decided to stick to a target of net zero by 2070, and that is also like a very uh, liberal target, I can say, because most of the countries net zero target revolve around 2045 2050, but India still pushed it a bit. But still, it was appreciated by most of the countries, because at least India started fixing to a target. But here you have written that specifically legal binding mitigation targets, so this was not always the case, so you can just avoid it at this point. The concept of voluntary commitments, yeah, this is good. Like, India does agree with voluntary commitments. Clean development mechanism, okay, in Kyoto, as it provided vulnerable opportunity. The need for developing countries participation. So again, need for developing countries participation is the same point like global south. mentioned it once again. Launch for national plan on climate change. This can be avoided because again this is a very domestic plan. So if you start talking about domestic issues, then multiple things you can write about, but that is not asked. This question is basically about foreign. What has been India's stand related to foreign forums or like diplomatic stand or in related to geopolitics. So you can talk about things like International Solar Alliance, or you can talk about life movement, or you can talk about one sun, one world, one grid, where multiple countries are involved, and India has taken the role of leadership rather than domestic initiatives. Try to talk about international initiatives. The signing of major economics forum leaders participating in energy and climate. So this is okay. India's emergence as a proactive player. So this is good. Like India has become a proactive player. Here again, here you can just give those examples that I just mentioned. Copenhagen Accord to prevent the death of CBDR. Okay, Paris Agreement that India enhanced, following which India adopted. Okay, so I think a lot of points you have mentioned. I think Paris Agreement was not required. If you are just mentioning COP26, one of the targets you need to mention. For example, you can just talk about Glasgow or Paris. So if you are talking about Glasgow, it is no need to talk about Paris Agreement. What you can add here is you can focus on this term called geopolitics and mention some of the initiatives of India at regional level or the multilateral. For example, in BIMSTEC, SARC, or bilateral initiatives that India is taking with different countries. For example, Denmark. You can talk about Israel. So all of with all those countries, India is progressing in the field of environment. So you can talk about that and try to restrict it to like 7 8 points. A lot many points are also not required. For example, it becomes repetitive after 1 or 2 points. For example, CBDR is mentioned multiple times and in multiple ways. Global South is also mentioned in multiple ways. So uh, use the keywords but don't repeat same points. For example, when you are talking about Global South, you can smartly differentiate it into technology transfer, for climate finance. So these are very important arguments or keywords that are seen in news or many like streams of discussion follow along these lines. So you can use these keywords as separate points, but just talking about global south, developing countries and least developed countries are like similar things. So avoid talking about the same thing in multiple points. Next, following which India adopted Panchamrit initiative. Okay, so International Solar Alliance, One Sun, One World, One Grid. Okay, so you have mentioned these things. This is fine. Just no need to mention it in a different format. Just go mentioning it in the point that you have already talked about. For example, National Green Hydrogen Mission is not required. Uh, Panchamrit initiative, can you mention at the top of your answer when you start talking about India's progress or India? Because that will give a very boost to the answer when you talk about India's initiatives at the start only. That will show the examiner that yes, you have the knowledge, recent knowledge of what India is doing and on in this field of climate change. And then you go on to talk about India's overall thinking or the philosophy behind its climate negotiations. But the first and foremost point can be about what have been the tangible benefits or the tangible achievements of India regarding to climate change. And this ISA OSOWG, I just said that you could have mentioned somewhere India's emergence as a proactive player or India's participatory approach. Here you can mention those things as examples. So that will make your answer more crisp, and also no need to mention separate sections because I don't think you will get so much of time in the exam hall to write in details about every small thing. So just try to integrate some of the points. Next, this part you can mention challenges. For example, I've talked about this also. Loss and damage fund is okay, but in recent COP27, I think there was a bit of progress on this loss and damage. Various policies of the government is also okay. Huge installation cost of renewable energy plants, shortage of skill. So this is fine. Just again, make it crisp. No need to explain a lot because challenges has not been exclusively asked. So way forward, when you are talking about challenges, I think it is not required here. But again, if you want to mention, try to mention it some smart art format. For example, just mention draw a circle and mention 2 3 way forwards. Don't go for writing all of this because I think you won't get so much of time or uh, thought thinking time in the examination hall to write all of these things. But try to stimulate your environment according to that only. India is actively engaged in when you start drawing some flowcharts now, you will automatically uh, be like acclimatized to it. Like you will get practice from that. And the first thing that in examination hall, when you come through a section that is not being asked, but you want to write, for example, you have decent enough knowledge and question is not asking that, but you want to show it. So if you are in the practice of drawing flowcharts and all, you will instantly, it will hit your mind that I should draw it and move on. So that is a very good approach that many people employ and get some good marks. So you can do that here also, like instead of going point wise and all, you can do that, because otherwise the answer becomes quite bulky. India is actively engaged in combating climate change and has implemented plethora of policies as initiatives to promote clean energy. These efforts are driven from both domestic and geopolitical interests and concerns. Okay, but uh, here you can just summarize India's philosophy about climate change, because the question is asking about that only, like what has been India's approach towards climate change in the geopolitics. For example, India's changing policy towards climate change. So rather than talking about domestic things, you can talk about like how India has evolved from like being a junior player. You can just talk about that from being just a listener or a rule taker. India has emerged as a uh, rule giver. Like India has started making rules or making initiatives. For example, that point about proactiveness or becoming more participatory, that can be emphasized upon a bit in the conclusion. So I think overall you have written well, but presentation wise, again, this answer could have been improved. Try making the answer more crisp. For example, you have used one, two, three, four pages, no, more than four, 5 pages to basically write one answer. I don't think you will get so much of space in UPSC. So they just give 3 pages for this 15 marker answer. So try to wrap it up within 2.5 to 3 pages. That will be like a good exam hall simulated writing, and that will improve upon your like skills of concising the answer. Believe me, this making the answer crisp and concise is also one of the skills that many of us don't have. Like people just keep on writing. Many students have seen copies. What they do is like they keep on writing, and in the end, like the answer gets haywire. For example, they start on a very good note, start explaining, and then by the time the answer is supposed to end, it becomes very house powered. So again, that leads to loss of marks. So that is also an art, like how to present it in a very crisp way. So don't go for writing 12, 13 points in any answer. That is not required. So if make a thumb rule, like you will write maximum 7 to 8 points in the crux of a 15 marker, or 4 or 5 points in a 10 marker. So I think that is sufficient. Stick to that and try to include all your points in that argument only, like in those 7 8 points only. Wherever possible, try to integrate it. Like wherever you see that 2 points are similar and you have 2 points separate, so you can just integrate it, use the keywords, and move on. So that will make your answer more crisp. So overall, I think you will get 4.5 out of 15 for this answer. Varsha, presentation wise, you need to work a bit. I don't think content is an issue with you. You have written like most of the things that I have talked in even my answer. So I think content wise, I don't see a problem. Just try to make it more crisp and accurate. So that will help you in getting more marks. Next, we move to Avnish's copy. Clean energy comes from generation systems that do not produce any kind of pollution, notably greenhouse gases. Okay. So again, you have talked about definition of clean energy. Uh, Fine, but I think this question, if this was a GS3 question, this was a suitable intro, I'll say, because this question is not asking about clean energy. It is saying that clean energy is the order of the day, but it is more related to geopolitics. For example, India's policy change towards clean energy. So I think a more suitable introduction would have been about how India has talked about clean energy. Like you can just mention some of the initiatives that India has taken regarding to it. For example, the Glasgow Panchamrit initiative could have been mentioned. If it was a GS3 question, this was a decent enough introduction. Next, we move to talking about sources of clean energy. No, again, this is not required, because I hope you understand that this question is basically about, for example, I have mentioned the topic. It is about foreign policy or effect of policies of developing countries on India. So try to talk about more from the perspective of international relations, India's climate change politics, or India's climate change diplomacy. So those things should take prominence in this answer, rather than this sources and like getting into the technical details of clean energy. So rather than that, you can just go on for that. So when it is saying that clean energy is the order of the day, it does not expect you to explain clean energy. it is order of the day means it is becoming very prominent. Like most countries are talking about it. So you just need to give two, three examples, and I think that will suffice. Current situation, India is a major force in global energy consumption has more than doubled. Okay, soon to be the world's largest in period of rapid. Okay, near universal household access to electricity or achieved renewable energy sources. So this renewable energy sources again goes a bit becomes a bit technical, which is not required. Uh, what you can do is you can manage with this also when we talk about prominence of clean energy. For example, current situation. So if you, it would have been better if you could have talked about multiple countries and their commitments to clean energy or their initiatives about clean energy. But even if you talk about India, talk about two or three points, and I think that will be decent. Just talk about what India has been doing in the context of clean energy, and that will show the prominence of clean energy. This part is not required, I guess. Next, we move on to India's policy towards climate change. Okay, thermal seek adaptation. It outlines 30 adaptation to enhance for 4 billion people living in most climate vulnerable communities. So we are talking about now India's policy. So this is not required. For example, relate every point to India, like how India is are going for. If even if you talk about this recent thermal seek adaptation agenda, talk about how India has argued for whatever it has argued. Don't go on broadly explaining what has been the result or what has been the achievements of those conferences. That is not asked. Action on water adaptation legislation. It has been launched by the importance of water as both climate change problem. Potential solution: African Carbon Market Initiative launched to support the growth of carbon credit in Africa and the Global Renewable Alliance for the first time. So I think you have gone a bit more broad in this part. I think this part is more suitable for showing how clean energy is the order of the day, because you have just talked about importance of clean energy and most of the agreements talking about clean energy. So if you are talking about these things in this part, that is fine. But when you are talking about India's policy, you just need to show how it has evolved, like how India has talked about CBDR, like common but differentiated responsibility, how India has taken up the leadership of the global south, how India has talked about climate change in its multilateral or regional agreements, how it has uh, talked about climate change when it goes to the table on bilateral initiatives. So keep focus on India and its policies regarding climate change. So that is what has been asked in this. So I think you can curate your answer according to that. Way forward at COP21 Paris, India committed to 40%. So this is fine. India has always shown its willingness in leadership to fight climate change. This is actually okay. So in conclusion is also fine. But again, India has not always shown its willingness in leadership, especially in climate negotiations. For example, India was a rule taker for multiple years after post independence because we had basically different priorities. We are not uh, prioritized to look after climate change as our most important goal. So we were not into it that much. So you can talk about it that we have changed our approach from being rule taker to rule former or rule giver. So you can mention that, or becoming more participatory or proactive. So overall, I think you understood what I tried to convey in this part, especially in this body. You just need to talk about more about India and what has been its changes in policy regarding climate change. So that would have been better in this answer. So overall, I think just because you have quite decently explained how clean energy is the order of the day, you will get 2.5 marks out in this answer. But if you want to get some more marks, just talk about keep focus on India, and I think that will immensely help you in this answer. Next, we move to Manuj Ansu's answer. Clean energy plays a significant role in ensuring energy security and reducing impact. Okay. Even though India has traditionally prioritized economic development and climate policy, it is now seen to shifting towards clean energy policy to implement Kyoto Protocol, India's changing climate policy at international policy. Paris Agreement, climate finance restructuring, lead IT plus decarbonizing transport initiative, goal of new climate. Okay. Okay. So I think first of all, in this introduction, clean energy is the order of the day. It does not restrict you to just talking about India or India's. contributions to clean energy. Here you can just be a bit broad, and although first one or two lines about India or initiatives that India has taken for clean energy, especially the recent ones, uh, is good to be mentioned, but also get a bit broad and talk about how it is not only India that is concerned with clean energy, but most of the world or all the major powers of the world are concerned with clean energy. So that will be a better introduction, or I think this better explanation of this statement. Next, describe briefly India's changing policy. So, earlier policy New Delhi declaration demand for finance or technology developed nations to emphasis on CBDR RC or UNCC's demand for adaptation fund to implement. So, I think you don't need to talk about it in this manner. For example, this emphasis on CBDR is still there. Like India has not completely avoided it or stopped it. So, what it makes it, if you talk about earlier policy and changes in recent policy, so that makes it very stark different. You need to give some stark differences, but that has not been the case. What has happened is like India's climate change policy has evolved over time. Like we have started from a low base, and now we are just moving forward, taking more steps. So instead of writing earlier policy, you can just give a heading, subheading along the lines of evolution of India's climate policy, or just picking up the argument from this statement itself, like India's changing policy towards climate change. So that would have been a better subheading for this part. Next, I don't think national action plan for climate change is relevant here, because this talks about mostly the domestic plans of India. So rather than it, you can just talk about India's goals in like Glasgow, or the targets that Modi ji talked about, or the Panchamrit initiative. So that is an important thing that you could have written in this answer. Paris Agreement is fine. Climate finance restructuring is also fine. Loss and damage fund is also okay. For example, these are the things that India has been doing, so it is okay. Role of new climate policy in geopolitics, I think again you can just integrate it to this part only, because this question is basically considered with uh, this only, like how India has, according to geopolitics, changed its climate policy. So India has not been a standalone country, like it has come to the forum and just talked about a new thing, or started arguing about something based on its own perceptions or its own domestic initiatives. Uh, Climate policy has evolved according to the geopolitics only, like what has been happening around the world, how countries are reacting, how everyone is talking about climate. According to that only, India has also been forming its climate policy. So try to integrate this part when you talk about India's policy of changing climate, like in this part only. So here, so you need not mention it differently. For example, you can argue about global leadership of global South, mention about climate finance, technology transfer. So try to use these keywords also wherever possible. So I think that would have been better approach to present this answer. Way forward is again good. You can mention leverage G20 presidency is okay. Ensure climate finance targets, technology transfer, okay. As a result, India's shift in its climate change policy would help to emerge as a global power. So okay, this is also decent. Like you have just summarized the like India's ambition. So this is fine. But I think some of the targets have not been mentioned. For example, you could have talked a bit more about how India has moved on from just like no targets to at least some target. For example, you can say that India initially was pretty opposed to like a fixed target for climate goals. So that has been a change. Even if you did not want to mention that, you could have just talked about that Panchamrit target, and then mentioned that in earlier times India was not in favor of fixed target because of India wanted to maintain its strategic autonomy and all. So I think I'll try to update your answer from the answer from some of the good copies. Like just try to mention some of the more uh, policy-wise thinking of India that has changed, and try to integrate it all into one part only. No need to mention other parts in two or three parts. So I think for this answer you will get four, because you have stuck to mentioned many initiatives and stuck to what has been asked in the question. But again, it could have been presented in a more better way, Manoj Anshu. So that is it for today, guys. I think most of you are writing answers. However, there has been a drop also, like some people have dropped off. I think keep on writing answer. I understand that prelims is approaching, but still I think one answer a day is a pretty easy target that you can always do. Just try to ensure that you finish up your answers in 8 to 10 minutes. Like don't sit on it and procrastinate and take 1 or 2 hours to write one answer. Just finish it inside 8 to 10 minutes. That will just give you a simulation of the exam hall. Like in the exam hall, you won't be knowing the questions that will come. So there will be an element of surprise. So even that can be practiced if you start writing answer within 8 to 10 minutes here also. So that will be it for today, guys. Again, we will meet tomorrow with a new question and a discussion session in the evening. So that will be it for today, guys. We will meet tomorrow, and if you want personalized evaluation and checking, you can just join the CD Warzone Prime Initiative. So thank you very much, and we will meet again tomorrow.